He was dying in the dirt, and that was the first truth. The second truth was that he was dying for a stranger, a woman who now stood over him, perfectly untouched, while his own blood made mud of the dust. His shirt was a road map of ruin, torn by knife and arrow, and each breath felt like swallowing hot coals. He had thrown his body in front of hers, a shield of flesh and bone against the men who came from the dark. Now, those men were gone or dead, and she was still here, alive, perfect, and silent. The silence was the worst part, louder than the battle that had just ended. He expected tears, or a thank you, or something. Instead, she just watched him, her eyes wide and dark in the twilight. He saw a universe of fear in them, but something else, too. Something he couldn't name. Then, with a last shuddering breath that wasn't a word, she turned. And she ran. Not stumbling, not panicked. She ran with a purpose, a fluid motion that devoured the ground and vanished into the tree line like a ghost. She was just gone. He didn't call after her. He couldn't. His body was a broken thing. With a groan that was half curse, half prayer, he began to crawl. Each movement was an argument with death. The short distance to his cabin became a mile-long pilgrimage of pain. He dragged himself over the porch, the rough wood splintering into his palms, and collapsed inside. That night, the fire in his hearth was a pitiful flicker, offering no warmth, only company. He fumbled with bandages, his hands shaking so badly he could barely tie a knot. The shadows in the corners of the room grew long and deep, and finally, they swallowed him whole. He drifted in and out of consciousness, the indifferent stars wheeling in the sky outside his window. The only thing that kept him anchored to the world was the memory of her face. That strange, haunted look in her eyes just before she disappeared. Dawn was a cruel mercy. It spilled pale light across his floor, showing him the mess of his life in stark detail. He forced himself up, his ribs screaming, the bandages clinging to his wounds like a second skin. But the world doesn't stop for a man's pain. Horses need water. Wood needs chopping. So he worked. He moved like a man twice his age, each swing of the axe a fresh wave of agony. But he knew this rhythm. Pain had been his companion for years. Loneliness was a worn, comfortable coat. Loneliness didn't betray you. Loneliness never asked you to trust it. And that's when he saw her. At first, he thought the heat was playing tricks on his eyes. A shimmer on the horizon, a figure walking out of the blinding sun. A mirage born of blood loss and exhaustion. But the figure didn't vanish. It grew clearer, more solid. It was her. Braids trailing behind her, shoulders set with a resolve that hadn't been there before. She wasn't carrying a weapon. She was carrying a purpose. She walked right up to the edge of his property and stopped, her feet planted firm in the dirt. Her voice was steady, but he saw her hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides. "Let me work," she said, her voice clear and low, "to repay what you did. I can't carry the weight of owing a life." He just stared at her, the axe heavy in his hand. He was tired of debts, tired of fighting, tired of living. He shook his head, a slow, painful motion. "You owe me nothing," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "Shelter's here if you need it, work if you want, but not as a debt." He turned back to the woodpile, a clear dismissal. His body was screaming for rest, but his pride wouldn't let him stop. He expected her to leave. He wanted her to leave, but she didn't. She hesitated for a moment, then walked past him, onto the porch, and into his cabin. He heard the scrape of a broom on the floorboards. The silence he had grown so used to was suddenly filled with her presence. The day unfolded in a series of small, unspoken movements. She set a pot of water to boil on the fire without asking. She swept years of dust from the corners while he sat, pretending to sharpen a knife. When one of his bandages came loose, she stepped forward and retied it. Her fingers were nimble, efficient, and they trembled a little less this time. He didn't stop her. He had lived alone for so long, he'd forgotten what it was like to share a space. But the cabin didn't feel empty anymore. It felt occupied. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to mean something. That afternoon, he noticed something strange. The knot she had tied in his bandage wasn't a simple square knot. It was a taut-line hitch, a knot used by sailors and soldiers for its reliability under pressure. A knot you don't learn by accident. A knot tied with an efficiency that made a cold dread pool in his stomach. He looked at her, really looked at her, as she moved about his home, and a question burned in his mind. Who was this woman? Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. They lived in a silence that was thick with unspoken questions. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was the quiet of two predators circling each other, unsure if they were friend or foe. He watched her constantly. She never relaxed. Her back was always straight, her eyes always scanning the horizon as if expecting an attack. She moved with a strange economy of motion, a purposefulness that didn't fit with the simple chores of a farm. She stacked firewood not in a haphazard pile, but in a structured wall that could serve as a defensive barrier. She drew water from the well with a swift, practiced rhythm, never spilling a drop. It was the kind of discipline he'd only ever seen in one other place: the army. A week after she returned, a neighbor rode over. Jedediah was an old man with a face like a dried-up riverbed, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He tipped his hat to the cowboy but kept his gaze fixed on the woman who was mending a fence near the barn. Jedediah spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "You're a fool, son," he muttered, his voice low. "A damn fool." The cowboy didn't say anything, just kept his hand resting on the axe handle. "I know her kind," Jedediah went on, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Seen it before. That ain't no farmer's daughter running from a bad situation. That's trouble wearing a pretty face. You mark my words." He leaned closer, the smell of cheap whiskey on his breath. "Heard stories down at the trading post about a band of raiders, hard cases led by a woman they called the Ghost. Cunning as a coyote, they said. Struck settlements up north, vanished before the law could even saddle up. Story goes, her own crew turned on her. Wiped 'em all out, but they never found her body." The cowboy stared at Jedediah, his mind racing. A ghost. It fit, the way she'd vanished into the trees, the way she'd reappeared out of the heat haze. He wanted to laugh it off as old man rambling, but a cold seed of doubt had been planted. He sent Jedediah on his way with a non-committal grunt, but the old man's words echoed in his head. That night, the air grew cold. He sat on the porch, oiling his rifle, the familiar clicks of the mechanism a small comfort in the vast, dark quiet. Then he heard it, a sound that curled through the night and raised the hairs on his arms. She was sitting on the far side of the porch, her face turned up to the stars, and she was singing. The melody was low and ancient, the words in a tongue he had never heard. It was a song of immense sadness, a lament for something lost. But underneath the sorrow, there was something else. A thread of defiance, a warning. The song seemed to hang in the air long after she finished. The silence that followed was different. It was heavy, charged. He gripped his rifle, his knuckles white. His instincts, honed by years of solitude and survival, were screaming at him. They were not alone. He scanned the tree line, his eyes searching the deep pockets of shadow beyond the faint halo of his lantern light. Nothing. And yet, the feeling persisted. A prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the kind that tells you you're being watched. And then he saw it. A flicker of movement. A shadow detaching itself from another shadow. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate. too slow. A man, crouched low, moving toward the cabin. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, the metal cold against his cheek, his finger sliding onto the trigger. He took a steadying breath, lining up the shot. Before he could fire, she was there. One moment she was on the other side of the porch, the next she was beside him, a phantom in the dark. A long, wicked-looking knife was clutched in her hand, the blade catching a sliver of starlight. She moved without a sound. He hadn't even heard her stand up. She put a hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly strong, and whispered a single word into the night. It was a word from her song. Out in the darkness, the shadow froze. It remained perfectly still for a long, agonizing second. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it retreated, melting back into the blackness of the trees. It was gone. The cowboy lowered his rifle, his heart hammering against his ribs. He turned to look at her. The soft, uncertain woman who had been tending his wounds was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely. Her eyes, fixed on the spot where the shadow had been, were not the eyes of a frightened victim. They were as cold and hard as river stones. She finally turned her gaze to him, and the look in them sent a shiver down his spine. It was a look that held no gratitude, no fear, only a chilling resignation. "They found me," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "And now they've found you." "Who found you?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. The rifle felt heavy in his hands, suddenly useless. The real danger wasn't something he could just shoot. It was standing right next to him. She turned her back on him, walking to the edge of the porch and staring out into the oppressive darkness. "The ones I ran from." "That doesn't answer my question," he pressed, stepping toward her. "That thing in the woods, it obeyed you. You spoke one word and it left. Who are you?" She finally faced him, her expression unreadable in the gloom. "The less you know, the longer you'll live," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You saved my life. Don't make me be the reason you lose yours. I'll be gone by morning." Anger, hot and sharp, flared in his chest. It was a mix of fear, confusion, and a strange sense of betrayal. He had bled for her. He had let her into his home, into his solitude, and she was a lie, a ghost with secrets that could get him killed. "Good," he bit out, the word tasting like ash. "Go, the sooner the better." He stormed back into the cabin, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed in the small space, a final angry punctuation mark. He didn't sleep. He sat in his chair by the cold hearth, his rifle across his knees, and listened. He listened for the sound of her leaving, but all he heard was the wind whispering secrets to the plains. When the first gray light of dawn began to creep into the room, he heard the faint sound of her moving, a small bag being packed, the soft tread of her boots on the floorboards. The door creaked open, then shut. She was gone. A profound, aching emptiness settled over the cabin. It was what he wanted. So why did it feel like he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life? He waited an hour, then another. The sun was fully up now, burning off the morning chill. He told himself he was glad she was gone. His life was his own again. Simple, quiet, safe. But the silence was deafening. He walked out onto the porch, half expecting to see her walking away, a small figure receding into the distance. The plains were empty. It was as if she had never been there at all. Then he heard it. The rhythmic sound of a horse approaching, steady and unhurried. He squinted against the sun. A lone rider was coming up the track to his cabin. The man rode tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered and confident. There was an arrogance in the way he held the reins. As he got closer, the cowboy's blood ran cold. He recognized the man, and he recognized the distinctive silver-inlaid emblem on the man's saddle, a coiled rattlesnake. Before he could react, the front door of the cabin was flung open. She stood there, her eyes wide with a terror he had never seen before. She looked at the rider, then at him, and her face was ashen. "Inside!" she hissed, grabbing his arm and yanking him back into the cabin. Now! Don't let him see me! She slammed the door shut, plunging them into the dim interior. Through the grimy window, they watched the rider pull his horse to a halt in the yard. The man dismounted, his boots sinking into the dust. He swept his gaze over the small cabin, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. Then he called out, his voice carrying an easy authority that grated on the cowboy's nerves. Caleb, I know you're in there. Been a long time, old friend. Come on out and have a drink. Caleb. No one had called him that in years. He was just the cowboy now, a man without a past. But this man, this rider, he was from that past. A past Caleb had nearly died to escape. Who is he? Caleb whispered, his eyes locked on the figure outside. She was pressed against the wall, trying to make herself invisible. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. His name is Silas, she said, her voice trembling, and he's the man I ran from. Caleb's world tilted on its axis, the raiders, the song, the shadow in the woods. It all started to click into place, forming a picture he didn't want to see. Silas called out again, his tone less friendly now. Don't make me come in there, Caleb. I'm not here for you. I'm on a job, hunting a bounty. A little slip of a thing, worth more gold than you've ever seen. Betrayed her own people, she did. Left 'em for dead. Last seen, heading this way. He described her perfectly, right down to the color of her eyes. You seen anyone like that, Caleb? Or are you still hiding from the world? Caleb felt her gaze on him. He had a choice, a simple, terrible choice. He could open the door, hand her over to Silas, and his old life would leave him alone for good. Silas would get his bounty, and Caleb would get his solitude back. Or he could protect her. He could lie to a man he knew to be ruthless and unforgiving, and in doing so, declare war on his own past. He looked at her, at the raw terror in her eyes, and he remembered the feeling of her hands tending his wounds. He remembered the sound of her sad, beautiful song. He took a deep breath, walked to the door, and opened it. He stepped out onto the porch, squinting in the sunlight, making sure his body blocked the doorway. Silas, he said, his voice flat. What do you want? Silas's smirk widened. There he is, the ghost of Crimson Canyon. I just want to know if you've seen the girl, Caleb. Simple question. Caleb met his gaze without flinching. Haven't seen anyone for months. You know I like my privacy. Silas studied him for a long moment, his eyes cold and calculating. He didn't believe him, not for a second. He glanced past Caleb toward the closed door of the cabin. Is that so? He said softly. Well, the desert always gives up its secrets, old friend. Always. He swung himself back into the saddle, his movements fluid and dangerous. I'll be back, and I'll be checking every rock and every shadow. With a final menacing glare, he spurred his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the air like a threat. Caleb waited until Silas was a speck on the horizon before he stepped back inside, his body trembling with adrenaline. The woman was still pressed against the wall, her knuckles white where she gripped the hilt of her knife. He turned to face her, the pieces finally slotting together. The military knot, the disciplined movements, the fear of Silas. You're not just some girl on the run, are you? He said, his voice low and heavy. You're a soldier. Her composure finally broke. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She looked him straight in the eye, her own gaze filled with a world of pain and regret. I was, she whispered, her voice cracking. And the man you just lied to? He was my commander. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. A commander. The word landed like a stone, shattering the fragile peace they had built. She wasn't a victim he had saved from faceless bandits. She was a deserter, a fugitive from a disciplined, dangerous crew led by a man from his own dark past. He had saved her from her own people, and now, by lying to Silas, he had chosen her side. He had painted a target on his own back. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He slumped into a chair at the small table, the adrenaline leaving him feeling hollowed out and weary. "From the beginning." And so she told him. Her name was Ilara. She wasn't a raider, not really. She was part of an elite unit of enforcers, a private army owned by a wealthy land baron named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was systematically buying up all the land in the Northern Territories, and for those who wouldn't sell, he sent Silas and his unit to persuade them. They were brutal, efficient, and loyal. Ilara had been raised in that world. Her father was Silas's second-in-command, and she had been trained since she was a child to fight, to track, to obey. But she had a conscience, and that was a dangerous thing to have in Silas's company. The final straw came a month ago. Thorne wanted a small, independent ranch, one owned by a family with 3 young children. When the family refused to sell, Silas gave the order to burn them out. Not just the barn, the house, with the family still inside. Ilara couldn't do it. In the chaos of the night raid, she created a diversion, allowing the family to escape into the hills. Then she ran. She had been running ever since, with Silas and her former comrades hunting her as a traitor. The men he had fought off the day he met her. They were members of her old unit. They hadn't been trying to harm her. They had been trying to take her back. As she spoke, Caleb saw the truth of it in her eyes. The haunted look he could never place was guilt. The discipline in her movements was muscle memory. The song she sang wasn't just a lament. It was a lullaby her mother used to sing, a small piece of a life before Thorne and Silas had twisted it into something ugly. When she finished, the silence in the cabin was profound. Caleb looked at his own calloused hands, at the scars that crisscrossed his knuckles. He, too, had run from a past he couldn't stomach. He had been part of a posse, much like her unit, that had slowly turned from lawmen to glorified thugs. The ghost of Crimson Canyon wasn't just a nickname Silas had thrown at him. It was a reference to the day he had refused an order to execute a prisoner and had to fight his way out, leaving his old life behind in a flurry of gunfire and blood. He had come to this isolated patch of land to forget, to be alone. But the past, it seemed, had a long memory. He finally looked up at her. He saw not a traitor or a liability, but a reflection of himself. 2 people who had tried to do the right thing in a world that rewarded the wrong. "Thorne's reach is long," he said softly. "Silas won't give up. When he comes back, he'll bring more men." As if on cue, the sky outside began to darken. The wind picked up, rattling the window panes and whistling through the cracks in the walls. A storm was rolling in off the plains, a great, bruised purple mass of clouds that mirrored the turmoil in his heart. It was coming for them, unstoppable and violent. "Then we prepare," Ilara said, her voice regaining a sliver of its former strength. She stood up, her eyes scanning the small cabin not as a home, but as a fortress. "We barricade the windows. We reinforce the door." For the next hour, they worked together, a silent, efficient team. They moved the heavy table against the door. They nailed loose floorboards over the windows, leaving only small slits to see and shoot through. The storm hit with the force of a physical blow. Rain lashed against the cabin in solid sheets, and thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the very foundations of the small structure. Inside, the world was reduced to the dim light of a single lantern and the roar of the wind. The shared danger, the frantic work, it broke through the tension between them. The fear was a current that passed through them, creating a bond that words never could. At one point, while they were struggling to secure a shutter against the wind, a powerful gust tore it from their hands. They were thrown back against the wall, landing in a heap. For a moment, they were just 2 people, soaked and breathless, in the heart of a tempest. And for the first time, in the flickering lantern light, they laughed. It was a raw, unguarded sound, a release of all the fear and tension they had been holding inside. The laughter died down, leaving them close in the small, dark space. He could see the rain dripping from her hair, the rise and fall of her chest. He reached out, his rough fingers brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. His touch was hesitant, gentle. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his hand, her eyes closing for a fraction of a second. In that small gesture, he felt her trust, a fragile thing offered up in the middle of a storm. "I ran too," he heard himself say, the confession pulled from him by the intimacy of the moment. He told her about Crimson Canyon, about the man he had been, and why he had hidden himself away from the world. He spoke of the loneliness, the quiet shame he carried. She listened without judgment, her gaze never leaving his. For the first time, they were not the cowboy and the stranger, the savior and the saved. They were Caleb and Alara, two ghosts, finally seen by someone else. The storm raged all night, a wild symphony of wind and rain. They didn't sleep. They sat in the dark, talking, sharing the stories that had shaped them, the scars that had been left behind. As the storm began to subside with the approaching dawn, a fragile peace settled over them. They had survived the night. They had found each other in the darkness. The morning was unnaturally still. The air, washed clean by the rain, was crisp and cool. The world outside seemed reborn, but the mud told a different story. As Caleb stepped onto the porch, a cold dread washed over him. There, pressed deep into the soft earth, were tracks. Not just the tracks of Silas's horse. Dozens of them. A whole company of riders had circled his cabin during the height of the storm, using the noise to cover their approach. They were being watched. Hunted. He didn't have to say anything. Alara was right behind him, her eyes already scanning the ground, her face a mask of grim determination. "They're testing our defenses," she said, her voice low, "seeing how we react. Silas is patient. He'll wait for us to make a mistake." They spent the day preparing for a war. They cleaned and loaded every weapon Caleb owned, his rifle, a shotgun, and an old revolver. They filled every bucket and pot with water. They rationed out their remaining food. The quiet intimacy of the night before was replaced by the cold, hard focus of two soldiers preparing for a siege. There was no more fear, only a shared, deadly purpose. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and red, Alara approached him. She was holding a worn leather bundle. She unrolled it on the table, revealing a pistol. It was a beautiful, deadly object, its metal gleaming, perfectly maintained. It was far superior to Caleb's own rusty revolver. "I was hoping I would never have to use this again," she said, pushing it across the table toward him. Her face was pale, her expression strained. "It was my father's. Silas gave it back to me after he—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The unspoken words hung between them. "After he killed him. He'll be leading the attack. He won't send his men to do the job he wants to do himself." Caleb picked up the pistol. It felt balanced, comfortable in his hand, a tool of perfect destruction. He looked at Alara, at the pain and anger warring in her eyes, and he knew this was more than just a fight for survival. It was a fight for vengeance, a fight for redemption. And it was a fight they would face together. He nodded, his resolve hardening into steel. Let him come. The attack came just after dusk, as predicted. It was not a wild, chaotic rush. It was a calculated military assault. Figures emerged from the tree line, using the deepening shadows for cover, moving with a chilling coordination. They fanned out, surrounding the small cabin, their dark shapes melting into the landscape. "3 on the west by the woodpile," Alara whispered from her position at a crack in the wall. 2 more circling around to the barn. Silas will come from the front. He's arrogant." Caleb took his position at the front window, her father's pistol feeling like an extension of his own hand. The heavy rifle lay beside him. The air in the cabin was thick with tension, so dense it was hard to breathe. The world outside was silent, but it was a predator's silence, coiled and ready to strike. The first shot was a deafening crack that shattered the stillness, splintering the wood of the doorframe just inches from Caleb's head. And then the world exploded. Gunfire erupted from all sides, a storm of lead that tore through the thin walls of the cabin. Wood splintered, glass shattered. They were pinned down, a furious hailstorm of bullets ripping their small fortress apart. Caleb returned fire, each shot deliberate, aiming for the muzzle flashes he could see in the dark. Beside him, Elara was a blur of motion, firing the shotgun with a practiced calm that defied the chaos around them. She didn't waste a single shot. "Reloading," she'd call out, and he'd provide covering fire. "2 men moving on your left," she'd warn, and he'd pivot, firing into the darkness. They were more than just 2 people fighting for their lives. They were a single, cohesive unit. Her tactical mind and his raw strength moving in perfect sync. They held the line, turning the tide of the initial assault through sheer, stubborn willpower. The first wave of attackers fell back, leaving wounded men groaning in the dirt, but it was only a temporary reprieve. "That was just a probe," Elara breathed, reloading the shotgun with swift, sure movements. "He knows where we are now. The real attack is coming." Suddenly, a new sound cut through the night, the heavy, rhythmic thud of an axe against the back wall of the cabin. They were trying to break through. "I'll handle it," Elara said, grabbing the long knife from her belt. "Keep them pinned at the front." Before he could argue, she was gone, a shadow disappearing into the back room. Caleb was alone, his heart pounding. He could hear the frantic splintering of wood, followed by a sharp cry of pain, then silence. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus on the figures moving in the yard. He fired, reloaded, fired again, his world narrowing to the small slit in the wall and the deadly dance outside. Then he heard a shout from behind him. He spun around just as the reinforced front door burst inward, ripped from its hinges by 3 of Silas's men. They stormed in, their faces grim in the lantern light. Caleb shot the first man point blank, the pistol bucking in his hand. He swung the rifle like a club, knocking the second man off his feet. But the third one was on him, a long blade flashing. Caleb felt a searing, white-hot pain as the knife sliced across his side, tearing open old wounds. He staggered back, the pistol falling from his numb fingers. The man loomed over him, raising the knife for a killing blow. A blur of motion came from the side. Elara, her face smeared with dirt and something dark that looked like blood, slammed into the man's side, driving her own knife deep into his ribs. He grunted, his eyes wide with surprise, and collapsed. Caleb slumped against the wall, pressing a hand to his bleeding side. The pain was dizzying. Elara was at his side in an instant, her arm wrapping around him, her strength holding him up. "I'm okay," he gasped, though the blood seeping through his fingers told a different story. He looked at her then, really looked at her. Her eyes were fierce, her jaw set. She was no longer someone he had saved. She was his equal, his anchor in the storm of violence. With her beside him, he found a new reserve of strength. He pushed himself upright, grabbing his rifle. At that moment, Silas appeared in the shattered doorway, silhouetted against the night. He held a revolver in his hand, a cruel smile on his face. "Touching," he sneered. "The traitor and the coward dying together. I'll be sure to tell Thorne you put up a good fight." He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Elara's heart. Everything seemed to slow down. Caleb didn't think. He reacted. He shoved Elara to the floor and lunged toward Silas, ignoring the fire in his side. He was a wild animal, driven by pure instinct. He crashed into Silas, sending them both tumbling out into the yard. They rolled in the dirt, trading frantic, brutal blows. Caleb's wounds screamed in protest, but he ignored them, fueled by a surge of adrenaline. But Silas was stronger, uninjured. He landed a vicious punch to Caleb's jaw, stunning him. He scrambled on top of Caleb, pinning him to the ground, the cold muzzle of his revolver pressing against Caleb's forehead. "It's over, old friend," Silas hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. Suddenly, a shotgun blast roared through the night. It wasn't from the cabin. It came from the darkness near the barn. One of Silas's remaining men, who had been creeping up on them, cried out and fell. "Told you she was trouble," a familiar, gravelly voice called out. "But she's our trouble now." It was Jedediah, the old neighbor, holding a smoking shotgun. He had come back. He had chosen a side. The momentary distraction was all Alara needed. She had scooped up her father's pistol from the floor of the cabin. Now she stood over the two men, her face a cold, emotionless mask, the pistol aimed squarely at Silas's head. Silas froze, his eyes wide. He slowly raised his hands. "Alara," he said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "Think about what you're doing. Kill me, and Thorn will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Come back with me. I'll tell him you were captured. I can protect you." Alara's hand did not waver. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Caleb watched her, holding his breath. This was her moment of truth. Would she pull the trigger and become the killer Silas always claimed she was? Would she take the vengeance she was owed? Her finger tightened. Then, with a sharp exhale, she swung the heavy pistol, cracking it across Silas's temple with a sickening thud. He collapsed without a sound, unconscious. She stood over him, her chest heaving. "We're not him," she whispered, more to herself than to Caleb. They had won. The remaining attackers, seeing their leader fall, fled into the night. Jedediah helped them tie up Silas and the other wounded men. The cabin was a ruin, its walls pierced like cheesecloth, its door and windows gone. But in the wreckage, there was a sense of triumph. They had survived. Caleb and Alara collapsed onto the porch steps as the first hints of dawn painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. She gently pressed a strip of cloth against the knife wound in his side, her face close to his. Her hands were steady. His hand covered hers, holding it there. He looked into her eyes, seeing the warrior, the survivor, the woman he had come to. He wasn't sure what to call it, but it was real, and it was powerful. "You are not my debt," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are my life." The look she gave him in return was all the answer he needed. But as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the valley, they saw it. On the distant horizon, a cloud of dust was rising. It was not the small plume of a few riders. It was the massive, churning cloud of an army on the move. Thorn's army. Silas was just the advance party. The real war was coming. They knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that they could not win that fight. The small cabin, their hard-won sanctuary, was about to be wiped off the face of the earth. "We have to run," Caleb said, his voice grim as he struggled to his feet. "Where can we go?" Alara whispered, her eyes fixed on the approaching doom. "Thorn owns everything for 1,000 miles." There was no time for a proper wedding, no time for vows spoken before a priest. Their vows were exchanged in frantic, desperate moments as they packed saddlebags with what little they had left: food, water, ammunition. He pressed a small, simple ring into her hand. He had hammered it himself months ago from a horseshoe nail during a lonely night, a meaningless trinket then. Now it meant everything. It wasn't a promise of a peaceful future, but a promise to fight for one, together. She slipped it onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. Jedediah met them at the barn, his face set in grim lines. "I'll buy you some time," the old man said, hefting his shotgun. "Slow him down at the pass. Now get going, and don't look back." They didn't have the words to thank him. A shared, grateful nod was all they could manage before they were on their horses, galloping away from the only home Caleb had known, away from the approaching army. They rode hard and fast, the sound of the coming war at their backs. They didn't stop. They didn't look back, not until they reached a high ridge miles away. From there they could see it all, the tiny cabin, surrounded by hundreds of riders. A puff of smoke, then a bloom of orange flame as the cabin was set alight. Their home, their past, everything they had built and fought for was turning to ash. It was over. Caleb turned to look at her. She sat tall on her horse, the wind whipping her hair, the morning sun glinting off the simple ring on her finger. She was not the frightened, silent woman he had pulled from the dust. She was a warrior queen. And he was no longer a lonely hermit hiding from the world. He was the man by her side. "Where to now?" he asked, his voice rough. She turned her gaze from the burning remnants of their life and looked forward toward the endless, untamed horizon that stretched out before them. A small, determined smile touched her lips. "Somewhere they'll never find us." Their journey was far from over. Thorn's army was behind them, and a world of unknowns lay ahead. What they did next would determine not only their survival, but what kind of future they could build from the ashes. If you enjoyed this story, and you want to find out what happened when they made their desperate stand at Serpent's Pass, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. You won't want to miss what comes next.